This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a professor of history at Stanford University, who was the keynote speaker at an event that was held at the Leer Institute this week and was entitled Salonica, a multicultural city in the Ottoman Empire and the Greek state. Professor Aron Rodrigue, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So in your presentation, you offered a panorama of the Jewish presence in the city, known today as the Greek city of Thessaloniki, from the 15th century until the 20th century. Now, the late 15th century was your point of departure because Salonica became a noteworthy Jewish center in the wake of the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula as of 1492. So why did so many of these Spanish Jews, the original Sephardim, settle in Salonica, making it the largest city in Europe within a matter of several years?
Well, it's a complicated set of factors played into this. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged at the time as the strongest power in the Eastern Mediterranean rapidly, and into the Balkans spreading rapidly, was interested in increasing populations in cities that had suffered from warfare or to improve the economies of certain areas, and it moved people around within the empire, including Jews, into various other centers that were Jews within one area to another area, but also became open to what we now call the exiles from the Iberian Peninsula. And so at various stages after 1492, but very soon thereafter, a lot of the Jews who arrived in the Ottoman Empire found a hospitable land, and word, of course, spread around that this was a place they could go. And at the same time, many of them were directed. We presume, because there is a lack of evidence in this, it's not as if Salonika had already a pre-existing Jewish community, because they were not there at that particular time in 1492. So there is a very strong probability that they were led to revive this port city
by the Ottoman authorities.
Yes.
What was their interest in attracting those Jews from Spain in the first place and directing them to Salonika?
Well, basically, Jews, together with a lot of other groups, were seen as productive elements that could engage in trade and commerce. They were bringing a set of skills with them, and it was really largely also at that time in economic thinking, increasing the population was thought to be a very good thing, and that was part of the reasoning also of repopulating the areas that had now come under Ottoman rule for a few decades.
Repopulating with loyalists, right?
Exactly.
To counter the local population.
Not necessarily. I don't think that was really... in the case of the Jews, I don't think that really counted that much, because for that kind of policy of countering hostilities that may exist over conquered peoples, they would bring Turkish groups, large numbers of them. Which they also did, but I mean all over the Balkans. And that actually in some ways explains the presence of Turks in large numbers in the Balkans throughout the Ottoman centuries, and even to this day, especially a place like Bulgaria, for example, which is a very large Turkish Muslim minority. So I don't think it was so much about loyalty, but more utility at that stage.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that they were Jews, members of another religion, played no part in this?
No, it did not, because, of course, the Ottomans really adhered to the then Islamic policy of basically the peoples of the book had a place in under Ottoman rules as long as they knew their place, and as long as they essentially paid extra taxes for the right to live and for protection in the cities. That was pretty much the standard rule in Muslims of Muslims in all Muslim lands of the rulers.
And the Jews themselves who found refuge in that place after what probably would have been a very traumatic expulsion from their homeland. Were they grateful to their new patrons?
Oh yes, very much so. In fact, there's a large literature about praising in Hebrew at that time that was produced in the decades before and after the period of expulsion, praising the sultans and contrasting their attitude to that of Christian rulers, which had been, of course, acting very, very badly towards the Jews, and most of Western Europe is emptied of Jews through sets of expulsions. So the literature, the genre that emerges is interpreting all of this as the rise of a new power and much better comfort and living conditions than what existed in Christendom. And I think this kind of lasts for quite a while.
So that was the golden Medina of the 16th century.
Well, they did certainly compare that in a very, very positive ways, yes.
Right. And what about the patterns of resettlement there in Salonica? Did they try to replicate their life in Spain, all the structures, the community structure, institutions, etc.?
Right. Well, the interesting thing about that is that, in fact, Spain did not really exist as an entity when the Jews are leaving. I mean, it was only had come together and partially at that with the marriage of Isabel and Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabel of Castile, and in fact, the Jews that came from all over were really very much locally embedded. There was no united Jewish community in Spain. And so in many, many ways, they transplanted the kind of locally based communities onto Salonica, where, for example, if somebody came from a particular city, like, I don't know, Saragossa, or somebody came from a particular region, like Aragon, there would be synagogues based, and it's like actually later on in the 19th century and 20th century when immigrants stuck together and created Landsmannschaft in new areas of settlement. Ashkenazi immigrants coming, for example, to the United States or other places, they pretty much created kind of old home-based congregations, but eventually a slightly more unified structure developed, although as is to be expected, there was a lot of conflict between different Jewish congregations about who was doing what at what particular moment. But it's not the sense of congregation that we think of now. It was really much more based around a synagogue or a city or a region of origin in Spain and other groups, but that does not mean that, of course, people stuck to that. I mean, they could move from one to the other.
So over time there was a cohesiveness of the Jewish?
It would be very difficult to say whether it ever became cohesive. I think that was certainly much more cohesive than at the very beginning. And in some ways we could make the argument, and some historians have worked on that the whole notion of Sepharad, in terms of one unit, Sephardi, there came into being really in exile. I mean, of course, they were known as Sepharad. Sepharad was well known. It's the largest Jewish population in the world at the time of expulsion. So they were already known. It was a very renowned community throughout the Jewish world. But I think the kind of sense of getting together created a new kind of Sepharad in the Ottoman Empire.
And what was the day-to-day living like? I mean, what were the businesses that they did? You said that they came there for predominantly commercial reasons.
They were brought over.
Brought over, yeah.
And essentially, I think the first thing that we have to note is that a very important textile work and manufacturing and sale emerged. It's an area rich in wool, and the Jews are overwhelmingly focused around that. Also, Jews became grain merchants, and they became, essentially we find them in all the mercantile operations. And there's a very strong link with Venice in terms of exporting stuff or importing stuff, and also with Constantinople or Istanbul, which is the capital city that requires a lot of provisioning. So the Jews on the whole were engaged in all of these trades, but with very clear mark of sort of working with textiles. This lasts for several decades, well into the towards the end of the 16th century, when we start seeing the importation of European cloth, which begins to pose problems.
And was that because they brought it over with them from Spain? This kind of
yes,
or is it something that they developed because of the?
Yeah, no, they brought the. You mean the skills?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the skills were brought from Spain, but also from Italy, because there's a migration patterns beginning also from Italy, Sicily.
But later on.
No, it's actually
around the same time.
expulsions is around the same time in terms of Sicily, which was under the Spanish crown. They're eventually also being expelled, and then of course it spread, from generation to generation as a particular kind of trade.
And Salonica was had a Jewish majority quite early on.
Yes, indeed.
Did they seek any sort of autonomy, or did they actually rule the city politics, or did they?
No, because that is not what Jews used to do in the pre-modern world, or even in the modern world in
But not just because they were a minority, because it wasn't really in the DNA as well.
Well, yes, I mean, they would never have expected. They were still in exile. The whole notion of galut is kind of taken as a natural thing. And also they knew very well that if they interfered, the ruling caste and the ruling element was always Muslim. And that was one thing that would end in disaster if that was ever challenged. Mm-hmm. So there's never really any political power in any overt way that is really exercised. Of course, indirectly, wealthy Jewish merchants would have, of course, their links to the authorities in very multiple different ways, and there could be some influencing here and there, but there is the divide is the whole basis, the premise of Jewish existence in Muslim lands was that you never ruled over other Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward, or perhaps not so fast, to the 17th century with the arrival of Sabbatai Tzvi, the most famous false messiah in Jewish history, barring Jesus Christ. And the western parts of the Ottoman Empire were really Sabbatai's stomping ground. How did that affect the community of Salonica?
Well, it affected it in a very dramatic way. I think it's well known that there was a great deal of enthusiasm when Sabbatai Tzvi or Sabbatai Tzvi makes himself known as the Messiah. There's a great deal of Kabbalistic and Messianic expectations, and there's a great deal of joy, and this transcends the Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide, and it was also in Europe as well, and so they really followed Sabbatai Tzvi in large numbers. This is true in Izmir, in Istanbul, Salonica, elsewhere as well, but then of course he becomes too much of a threat to the Sultan and as a troublemaker, because of course there were conflicts with rabbis who did not accept him, others who did accept him, and as a result he's converted under duress to Islam, and that leads to the whole end of the movement. But he then justifies himself through a whole Kabbalistic kind of way of why he's converting, but bringing in the new Messianic age, and then as a result, after 1666, several hundred Jewish families to follow him converted to Islam, but remained Sabbatean in their theology. And it's very important to realize they did not remain Jewish. This is very, very, very frequently confused. They're not crypto-Jews because it's a new religion, and they were never accepted by the Jewish community. But they're also separate from the Muslims because underneath the notion of their being Muslim, they kept all kinds of practices, or they developed, rather, all kind of practices. So it's a kind of, and they're known as the dönme, the people who turned from Turkish, and they called themselves Maminim, however.
But these donmes remained in Salonica and lived side by side with former co-religionists.
Indeed, and they, side by side, they had that kind of area where they were more predominant. But yes, indeed, I mean, they did business with them, they did all these things. And by the way, that's one thing that there's total silence in Jewish sources and other sources about how they actually got on, whether there's absolutely total
it's
silence,
a great
which
embarrassment,
is actually,
isn't it?
yes, and this is not something that was kind of, I think the rabbinical elite was interested in talking about, and so there's a complete lack in any of the Jewish sources.
So what do we know about what happened to them eventually? Did they assimilate into the Muslim population, or did they go back to Judaism?
No, actually what really happens to them, which is a very interesting story is that they remain and emerge actually as a very powerful economic force in Salonica in the second half of the 19th century. And they're also leaders of the more reforming, more secularizing elements in the Muslim world. And in 1912 to 13, the Balkan War, Salonica becomes Greek and is incorporated into the Greek state. And at the end of the war with Turkey in 1923, there's an exchange of populations. And since they are Muslim, they, together with other Muslims, are, as part of the exchange of populations, move to Turkey. So their descendants are to be found in Turkey.
Right.
And they have been the object of a lot of anti-Semitic movements because they're seen as a kind of force from outside that entered Islam. And this usual story of the Jew within, as it were, while actually in reality most of them completely have now disappeared into the regular...
But they never try to go back into Judaism?
No, absolutely
Because they weren't welcome, or because they
they wouldn't be welcome because they would have to convert, obviously, formally. But that's not the point. The point is, I think that they developed their own sub-identity with their own theology. Actually, they split up, a very Jewish thing to do, into three sects, and some of them became closer to Islam, others kept apart, but eventually they merged into especially in the age of secularization in Turkey, they merged with the rest of the population.
Did this whole Sabbatean episode affect Salonica in a different manner from other Jewish communities in the area? We talked about Izmir.
The only group that converted, this hundreds of families, were in Salonica.
Oh.
No other area had this conversion. So
especially
it's
district.
distinctly Salonican. So to this day, if you know in Turkey, if somebody is from Salonica, there are of course regular Muslims there too, but it's indelibly marked with Salonica. I mean, that is indelibly linked with Salonica.
Mm-hmm. How interesting. We did mention the Italian influx at some point. Where they were most noticed was later on in the 18th and 19th centuries. How did they change the makeup of the Jewish community?
Well, there is a new migration from Italy beginning at the end of the 17th, but really in the early 18th century, because there's increasing demand for wool and grains in Europe. The Livorno community, and this is very well marked, and of course this is the same community from which Montefiore came, and this was a community which had vast trade networks in the 18th century into the 19th century around the Mediterranean. They were in Tunis, they were in other port cities, and eventually even in Aleppo. And so a lot of families begin to arrive, and they're known as Francos from the association with Frank was from Crusade times. It's in Arabic and in Muslim world there were Franks, as it were, and so they're Francos, and they're known by Jews as Francos. The Turks don't call them Francos, but anyway, and so they establish and become a very strong elite, and their names like Morpurgo, Modiano, Sayas, Fernandez. These are very major families that eventually will become extraordinarily wealthy, and they will be, and eventually the leading figure is going to be Moïse Alatini, and those become not only very wealthy, but as of the mid 19th century onwards, a very strong push towards reforming and westernizing the local Jewish community, and new schools, Western-type schools, especially collaborating with the French Jewish organization, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which created major school networks in the Mediterranean basin in Muslim countries, but especially in the Ottoman Empire, and then the Salonica schools opens in the 1870s.
So what did these reforms and westernization consist of other than schooling?
Well, the schooling, it really starts with schooling, but it also starts with the push is also coming from the state, which is itself reforming at that time. So making the administration work maybe better, the communal administrations, and eventually also, it doesn't go into the realm of religion, but through schooling and multiplying the schools, making the community as they would have called it, less obscurantist and fanatical. But there's a whole way in which the Western world, including the Francos, as they emerged later, became associated with seeing Eastern Jewries as sort of less civilized. And so at the time, with French being the lingua franca of the Mediterranean and this vast school network, it really gives rise to French becoming the language of education and instruction among large numbers of Sephardi Jews, and the rise, in fact, of a Francophone upper middle and middle class.
So this movement towards the Western orbit, in conjunction with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, both politically and civilizationally, does this make the Jewish community more ambivalent about their existence within the Ottoman Empire? A lot less than they were in the 16th century, right after their arrival?
No, because I think basically the Ottoman Empire and the ruling elite in the Ottoman Empire, even under the despotism of Abdul Hamid, the Red Sultan, second half of the 19th century, were on the whole themselves undergoing and pushing a reform and a westernizing project for the empire. And secondly, the Ottoman Jews, the Salonican Jews especially, realized very, very soon that the alternative was dire, because a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empire was better for the Jews than a unitary nation-state. So they remain extremely loyal to the very end to the Ottoman Empire, to the degree that they actually in 1912-13 they vociferously did not want to be incorporated into the Greek state. And there is a move to either remain Ottoman or internationalize Salonica as a city-state in which they would be able to do free trade, as it were, but when all is lost. So there is a very strong alliance of the Jews of the Ottoman Empire and the center, because they do not trust, especially in the Balkans, they do not trust new states that are emerging and what will happen to them. And there's a lot of friction with Greeks, especially. Exactly.
So it's the same kind of dynamic that takes place with the emergence of Greek nationalism.
Yes, absolutely.
What can you tell us about?
Well, I mean, that's really as of the 1820s. This is Lord Byron and all that. The Philhellene movement, and then the Greek Revolt. Eventually, it's called the Greek Revolution, which sweeps throughout Greece. It is put down in Salonica, but the Greek state emerges by 1830 and 1832. The Ottomans have to give it up, but it's much, much smaller. It sort of is only the Peloponnese, Athens, up towards a little bit further north, towards Thessaly. And so as far as that state is concerned, it has very few Jews, and in fact there have been massacres of Jews in the initial revolt, but eventually there is a Jewish community, of course, in those places, and that was only localized, the issue with. But there is also a great deal of economic competition between the Greek merchant class in Salonica, as well as kind of exacerbated nationalism. So it's not being necessarily as much anti-Greek as being really fearful of what changing this whole arrangement that lasted for centuries could mean. And as a result, of course, the Greeks saw them as the allies of the Turks. So once they become part of the Greek state and Salonica is incorporated into that state, it will be initially quite tough, but...
That sounds like an understatement.
No, I don't think it's really... we do not see much overt initially anti-Semitism, but there is a kind of, they are leery of each other. And then once it becomes clear that this is there to stay, the leading groups, certain elements of the leading groups in Salonica of the Jewish community.
Did no one suggest to include them in a population swap?
No, because they're not. The population swap was based exclusively on religion, interestingly. And so it was Christians versus Muslims that were exchanged. To the degree, for example, that there were Turkish-speaking Greek Orthodox Christians in Asia Minor that were sent over, and Greek-speaking Muslims were sent over to the other side. So that was very good. But
the
the Jews are
Jews
not in the picture. Nobody wants. I mean, they're not considered that important. I mean, unlike what we like to think, those people who do Jewish history, they were a kind of an afterthought at that time, and certainly the Muslim world was not obsessed with what it's obsessed with these days in terms of Israel or any of those kind of things. So the Jews are really not a very significant element in the preoccupation.
Even though, so they were no longer the moneyed elite of Salonica?
Well, they begin to decline. They still are actually substantial fortunes there, but of course there is the state is favoring a national economy policy, and also there's a great conflagration, the Great Fire of 1917, that destroys the Jewish quarter, but other quarters as well, but primarily where the Jews were, which is a big blow. And there begins to be, even before then, but accelerated after that, quite a lot of emigration. But still, the emigration is to multiple places. France, because they're Francophone, the United States, to Latin America, and of course to Palestine under the Mandate. And there is a strong Zionist movement that emerges at this time because it's everybody's turning nationalist, and the Jews, of course, are also very strongly influenced by ideas of Zionism as well. But there are, of course, the usual political conflicts within the community between the Zionists and socialists. What is unique, again, to Salonica, there are many unique features. It's the only place where there is also emerges at the end of the 19th century, and in this particular period, a real proletariat. A real working class. They are working in the tobacco trade, and they are really mostly Marxist. And so it's the only place in the world where Karl Marx was translated into Ladino. And there is a very strong movement, but again, it's internationalist. It works with the Greek working class movement and also other movements in the area. And so there are the socialists, there are the Zionists, or themselves maybe a little bit split according to various groups. And then, of course, there are the ones who really want to become as close as possible to Greeks, or Hellenizing, and saying this is where we are, and we're just something that's very familiar to other Jewish communities in Europe at that time.
And as if they didn't suffer enough blows, a few decades later comes the Second World War with the Nazi occupation of Greece.
Well, that is also the great tragedy, and it really is. Greece enters is on the side of the Allies. Germany is, they fight with the Italians, invade in 1941, and they begin to lose, and then the Germans come in, and they come all the way and occupy all of Greece, but the southern zone is Italian, but the area of Salonica is under Nazi rule. And then essentially what we see elsewhere in the Holocaust takes place. Some labor battalions are formed. Labor compulsory, then confiscation of property. At that time, the largest Jewish cemetery in Europe, which is the Salonica Jewish Cemetery, is, with the bidding of the Greek Municipal Council, destroyed, on which Aristotle University now stands. And that sort of is a major trauma. And then very soon thereafter, in 1943, in March, the deportations begin straight to Auschwitz. And in the space of just a few months, the whole community is deported, with only close to 50,000, 46 to 50,000, with only about 1,000 returning.
So the descendants of that community are those who had emigrated.
Exactly. The vast majority of the descendants of Salonica and Jewry are those who had emigrated before to various parts of the world.
And today can be found, like you said, in Israel, in America.
Indeed, yes.
In France and elsewhere.
Yes.
All right, Professor Aron Rodrigue, thank you very much for this. It was very interesting. You were the keynote speaker at the event at the Leer Institute that was held this week and entitled Salonica, a multicultural city in the Ottoman Empire and the Greek state. You're a professor of history at Stanford University, Thank you very much for this
Thank you.
interview.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer, and to the Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shenlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.